I worked night shifts for 10 years. Not occasionally, not as a temporary arrangement while we figured something else out. 10 years of leaving the house at 10:30 in the evening, driving to the hospital, working 12 hours, driving home at 7 in the morning, sleeping until 3 in the afternoon, waking up in time to make dinner and help with homework, and be present for the part of the day that my children were awake and needed me. 10 years. I am a registered nurse. I have been a registered nurse for 14 years, and I chose the night shift when my children were small because the night differential, the additional pay that hospitals offer for overnight hours, was the difference between a family that was comfortable and a family that was not. My husband Daniel's business was growing, but it was not yet profitable in the way that would sustain us at the level we needed, and I was the steady income, the insurance benefits, the financial floor that everything else was built on. I was not resentful of this. I want to be clear about that before I tell you the rest, because the rest is what it is, and I do not want it to be colored by resentment I did not feel. I had chosen this. I had looked at our situation when our first child was 2 years old, and I had made a calculation that prioritized the family, and I had been at peace with the calculation. Daniel was building something. It was going to take time. I was the bridge. That was how I understood it for 10 years. I came home early on a Thursday morning in February, and I understood it differently. The shift ended 3 hours early because of a staffing change that I will not detail because the details are not relevant. What is relevant is that at 4:15 in the morning, I was in my car driving home instead of at the nurse's station where I was supposed to be until 7. I was tired. I am always tired at 4:15 in the morning after 11 hours of a night shift. There is a specific quality of tiredness that belongs to that hour. Not the tiredness that sleep resolves, but the particular functional exhaustion of someone who has learned to operate in it because operating in it is required. I was thinking about my bed. I was thinking about 3 hours of extra sleep before I needed to be present again. I was not thinking about anything that required thought. I turned onto our street at 4:22 in the morning. There was a car in my driveway that I did not recognize. I parked on the street. I sat for a moment. I looked at the car, a silver sedan, relatively new, a gym bag visible through the back window. I thought about the possible explanations: a friend of Daniel's staying over for an early morning something, a car that had parked in the wrong driveway, something innocent, something that had an ordinary explanation. I got out of my car. I walked to the front door. I used my key. The house was quiet in the specific way of a house that has people sleeping in it. Not the absolute quiet of an empty house, but the occupied quiet, the particular atmosphere of inhabited space in the early hours. I took off my shoes at the door the way I always did, because I had learned over 10 years that the sounds of a returning nurse at 4 in the morning are sounds that wake children, and I had developed the specific, practiced quiet of someone who has come home in the dark for a decade. I set my bag down. I walked to the kitchen and I filled a glass of water. I stood at the kitchen counter and I drank the water, and I thought about the car in the driveway, and I thought about Daniel asleep upstairs, and I thought about nothing in particular. Then I walked upstairs. I am going to tell you what I found in the precise, factual way that I tell difficult things, not with drama, not with the emotional coloring that the situation warrants, and that came later, in full, over the weeks and months after this morning. Just the facts, in order, the way they presented themselves to me at 4:26 on a Thursday morning in February. The bedroom door was not fully closed. I pushed it open. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom for what I think was approximately 30 seconds. I want to be precise with the 30 seconds because they are the most significant 30 seconds in this story, and I think precision honors them. 30 seconds in which I understood with complete and irrevocable clarity what I was looking at. 30 seconds in which 10 years of night shifts and financial floors and building someone else's bridge reorganized themselves in my understanding into a picture that was not the picture I had believed I was living in. Then I closed the door. Not slammed. Closed. The careful, quiet close of someone who is still thinking about the children sleeping in the rooms down the hall and who has not yet decided what comes next, but who understands with complete certainty that waking the children is not part of it. I went back downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table. I did not cry. The crying came later, specifically and in full, and I will not minimize it by leaving it out of this telling, but at 4:27 in the morning at my kitchen table, it did not come. What came was the specific, clarifying coldness that I had felt before in difficult moments. Not the absence of feeling, but the temporary suspension of it while something more urgent occupied the foreground. I needed to think. I had 4 minutes before I heard movement upstairs. I know it was 4 minutes because I was looking at the clock on the microwave. In those 4 minutes, I made 3 decisions. The first decision was that I was not going to have the confrontation in this house at this hour with my children down the hall. The second decision was that I was going to document what I had seen before anyone had the opportunity to manage the narrative. The third decision was that I was going to call my sister. I took my phone out of my pocket. I opened the camera. I went back upstairs. I took 3 photographs, quietly, with the phone's shutter sound turned off, which I had done months earlier for reasons unrelated to this moment. I went back downstairs. I texted the photographs to my sister with the message, "I need you to hold these. I'll explain later. Don't call me yet." Then I sat back down at the kitchen table, and I waited. Daniel came downstairs at 4:31. He was wearing the specific, careful expression of a man who has heard something and is not certain what he heard and who is managing the uncertainty. He saw me at the kitchen table. He stopped. He said, "You're home early." I said, "Yes." He said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "Sit down, Daniel." He sat down. I said, "I need you to tell her to leave, quietly because the children are asleep. I need her out of this house in the next 10 minutes. He said, "Claire." I said, 10 minutes. Then I need you to sit here with me, and I need you to tell me how long. He was very still. He said, "Claire, I said, 10 minutes. He went back upstairs. I sat at the table. I heard quiet movement. I heard the front door, careful and soft, the way someone closes a door when they have been told to be quiet about it. Then Daniel came back downstairs and sat across from me at the kitchen table, where we had eaten 10 years of dinners that I had made after waking up at 3 in the afternoon, after sleeping through the mornings I was supposed to be awake for. I said, "How long?" He said, 2 years. 2 years. I want to sit with that number for a moment because I think it deserves to be sat with. 2 years. I had been working night shifts for 10 years. For 2 of those 10 years, while I was at the hospital at midnight and 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning, doing the work that paid the mortgage and the health insurance and the children's school fees and the grocery bills and the steady financial floor that Daniel's business was built on, for 2 of those years, this had been happening in my house, in my bed, while my children slept down the hall. I said, "Is she the only one?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Is the business actually doing what you've told me it's doing?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "It's doing well." I said, "Well enough that you haven't needed my income for how long?" He said, "About 18 months." I closed my eyes for a moment. 18 months. For 18 months, the business had been generating enough income that my night shifts were no longer the financial floor. For 18 months, I had been going to the hospital at 10:30 in the evening, not because we needed the money, but because what? Because the conversation about whether I still needed to had not happened? Because Daniel had not told me?
because I had continued in the arrangement we had built when it was necessary, not knowing it had stopped being necessary, going to the hospital every night while he stayed home.
I opened my eyes. I said, "I'm going to call my sister. She's going to come and stay for a few days. You're going to stay in the guest room until we've spoken to attorneys." He said, "Claire." I said, "That's what's going to happen today. We can talk about everything else after the children are awake and after I've slept and after I've spoken to an attorney." He said, "I'm sorry." I said, "I know." Then I went upstairs, I went to the bathroom, I stood at the sink, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I was wearing my scrubs. I had worked 11 hours. I was 41 years old. I had spent 10 years of nights at a hospital so that my family could be financially stable, and for 18 of those months, the financial stability had been achieved and no one had told me, and I had kept going to work anyway, every night, while the life I thought I was working for was something else entirely. I washed my face with cold water. Then I went to the guest room, not our bedroom, not yet, the guest room, and I lay down on the guest room bed, and I was asleep in approximately 4 minutes.
I called my attorney at 9 in the morning when I woke up. Her name was Sandra, and she had been my attorney for a previous matter years earlier, and I had kept her number for the same reason I keep things I hope never to need. I told her what had happened in the calm, ordered way I told difficult things. She said, "The photographs are important. Text them to me as well." I said, "Already done." She said, "The financial information, the business income, the timeline of when it became sufficient. Do you have access to any of that?" I said, "We have joint accounts. I have access to everything." She said, "Document what you can access today, before anything changes." I said, "I'll do it this afternoon." She said, "And the 10 years of night shifts, the income you contributed, the differential pay, all of it, that's going to matter." I said, "I have 10 years of pay stubs." Sandra said, "Good. Come and see me tomorrow morning." I said, "I'll be there." Then I got up. I showered. I put on normal clothes. I went downstairs and I made breakfast for my children who came down at 7:30 with the specific, uncomplicated morning energy of children who do not yet know that the shape of their family changed at 4:22 in the morning. I made pancakes because Thursday was pancake day, and I was not going to let what had happened in my bedroom change the fact that Thursday was pancake day. Not yet. Not until I was ready. My daughter said, "You're home early, Mom." I said, "I am." She said, "Is that good?" I said, "Yes, baby, it's good."
The divorce took 11 months. I will not walk you through all of it because 11 months of legal process is not the point of this story, and because some of it involves my children in ways I will not make public. What I will tell you is what mattered. The 10 years of night shift income mattered. Sandra presented it as exactly what it was, a decade of the primary financial contribution to a marriage and family, made at significant personal cost, during which the other party had not disclosed material changes in the financial situation that would have been relevant to the continuation of that arrangement. The 18 months mattered, the period during which Daniel had known the business was sufficient and had not told me, during which I had continued working nights not out of necessity but out of a conversation that had not happened, mattered in the specific way that omissions matter when they involve material information in a marriage. The settlement was, in Sandra's understated language, appropriate. I kept the house, my children kept their school, their routines, their Thursday pancakes. I kept the health insurance, which I had been providing for 10 years and which was now mine in a different context. And I kept my career. I want to tell you that specifically because some people assume that the thing to do after something like this is to change everything, to leave the hospital, to leave the night shifts, to leave the life that had been organized around someone else's needs. I did not leave my career. I changed my shifts. I moved to days which I had been eligible for years earlier and had not applied for because the night differential had seemed necessary. It had not been necessary for 18 months. I applied for the day shift the week after the divorce was final. I got it. I now come home in the late afternoon to a house where my children are doing homework and where Thursday is still pancake day and where the morning is mine. The morning had always been mine. I just hadn't been awake for it.
I want to tell you about the moment I walked out of the hospital on my last night shift. It was a Tuesday morning in November, the final shift of my notice period on nights, before the day position started. I had worked the full 12 hours. I walked out through the same doors I had walked out of for 10 years at 7 in the morning, with the same tired body and the same smell of hospital and the same squint against the morning light that I had trained myself to manage. Except that morning, I stood in the parking lot for a moment before I got in my car. Just stood there. 10 years of mornings I had walked out those doors and gotten in my car and driven home to sleep through the morning. 10 years of this exact quality of light, this exact tiredness, this exact parking lot. I stood there, and I thought about all of it. And then I got in my car and I drove home, and when I got there, my children were awake and eating breakfast, and my daughter said, "You're home at the right time today, Mom." I said, "I am." She said, "Is that going to keep happening?" I said, "Yes, baby, that's going to keep happening." She went back to her cereal, I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I watched a morning come through the window that I had not been awake for in 10 years. It was a good morning. And the morning you came home 3 hours early and walked through your own front door with your own key and found what you found, that morning did not erase the 10 years. It ended an arrangement that had been built on incomplete information. That is what it ended. The 10 years are still yours. Document what is yours. Call the attorney. Make the pancakes on Thursday, and find out what your mornings look like when they are finally yours to be awake for. She doesn't stay silent. She doesn't stay broken. She rises. Sometimes rising is coming home 3 hours early and finding out the truth, and sitting at the kitchen table and waiting. Sometimes rising is the first morning shift, the parking lot, the daughter who says, "You're home at the right time today, Mom." Sometimes rising is simply being awake for your own morning for the first time in 10 years. Subscribe. New story every week, and every single one of them ends the same way. She rises. Leave a comment. Have you ever sacrificed something for someone who didn't tell you the truth about whether the sacrifice was still needed? I read every single one.